Fantastic. I guess she'll join us a little bit later. How did you find the information, Quintessa, about yesterday's case studies? Uh-oh. Quintessa? Quintisha? Is it Quintisha or Quintessa? 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 Uh-oh. Uh-oh, the mic is gone. Fantastic. So Quintisha, is that right? Yes? That's got it. Okay. Fantastic. So your microphone is gone. That's not a problem. I'll watch the chat. So today we're going to take a look at the second section, which is actually quite important. Human rights, especially in, let's say, the HR field, is really a very important and very special area. Remember, I've mentioned this many, many times that when it comes to supervisors and managers, they're not always trained in how to deal with those issues that come up. One of the things that should actually take place is when they do have an issue, they should deal with it right away. It shouldn't just simply be, put it under the rug somewhere. So human rights issues are one of those things which are kind of challenging. I was looking at the news a little while ago, and I was watching what's happening in China and the United States. Really, the United States, they really have issues. There's so many conversing ideologies. It's fascinating to watch, but it's also dangerous if you happen to live there, which is unfortunate. And with the weather right now, they're really having really getting banged around, and so is China. Uh, so when it's in human resources, you really have to think about there is a clash of thoughts, a clash of ideologies. Um, Sometimes we don't recognize that not everybody understands the rules of the game, so to speak. And I'm saying that it's a game because basically the rules change according to the team players within that game. So a nation actually upholds certain values only when it agrees to those values as a collective. And sometimes those values change because the collective changes. In other words, the mixture changes rather dramatically. I'll give you an example. This is, unfortunately, we don't have these anymore, but the government used to sponsor quite a few different training sessions for the business community. And I used to take my students because I was a member of one of the councils in the Board of Trade. I was actually part of that, and I could take my students with me. So we would actually go down and listen to some of these. And one of them was on human resources, on international employees. So when you hired somebody from another country and you brought them into this country, what were some of the problems that were being run into? And because the business community needed to understand some of the ramifications from hiring somebody from another country, some of the cultural shocks that take place, and there are some big ones. One in particular was one that kind of shocked most of us. They had hired an individual, this was a Mississauga company, by the way, hired an individual who was coming from central India. Now, different provinces in different countries, different states, different countries, provinces, what have you, they have very different philosophies. Okay. It's just a question of how they were brought up, how they've evolved through the centuries, and what has been necessary for the protection of the community. So they changed their philosophies and their ideologies, and religion also has a part of this. What was rather fascinating about the story was they were indicating that the individual had been hired from central India because he was the number one person in that field. And they had recognized him internationally. And this was a supply chain company. And it was really a special individual. The problem is he had spent all of his life working in central India, which means there's a lot of class and prejudice, uh, especially towards sexes. In other words, male and female. There's a big difference between the two in certain provinces of India. You have to go there to see what's going on in a sense. But when people live in those environments, they're used to it. Women do not look you in the eye because it's considered to be unacceptable, unless, of course, you happen to be in certain parts of India where it's more British. So there's a greater British influence in their behavior, and they don't care. It's equilibrium. But in this particular situation, when he came to Canada, he immediately went to his office and started to work. And a young woman who came in was kind of rummaging through one of the desks at the front. And he walked up to her thinking that she was his secretary and told her to pick up his clothes at the cleaner, and she should also prepare a lunch for him. Uh, and when she had some time, she was to come in and put a chair beside his desk and wait for him to dictate some letters. In India, this is definitely a way that things are done. Okay, I understand that. I understand it. But in North America, this is not the way you treat people. Okay, you treat them a little differently. And unfortunately for him, it happened to be the owner of the company. So he had not met her at this point, and this was the first time he met her. She was just looking for a pen or a pencil or something in the desk. So it kind of gives you an indication that sometimes people don't really equate, uh, let's say, the cultural significance of another country and behavioral normalities. In some countries, when a person dies, people go in and take everything. This means the whole community just does a help yourself thing. And that happens, used to happen in Greece. Now, there are changes, and therefore, when people are coming into the country, they have and bring with them their own understanding of normality. So, the Human Rights Code and the harassment that we talked about yesterday are really pertinent for companies to disseminate that information throughout the organization so that people really understand what is acceptable behavior and what is not acceptable behavior. So we want to take a look at the second part of this now. For Keston, you're going to have to take a look at everything that I shared yesterday. And we're going to reiterate, we'll go over some of that at the beginning of this PowerPoint as well. So just to recap what we did yesterday, we talked about the 17 grounds. And these grounds are really, really important to us. They are incredibly important because they fundamentally decide and define what we're really looking at. They don't really define it as code. It's kind of a little different. It's just a definition in a sense. So things that we should be watching for. So the 17 grounds, once again, of discrimination, which are legal. Number one, citizenship. You cannot go asking people about their citizenship, and you can't discriminate based on where they have a citizenship. There are a lot of people who have multiple citizenships. And also race. You can't define the race of the individual. In other words, what kind of, let's say, whether they're Catholic or they're whatever religion they happen to be, Druid, what have you. A place of origin, where they actually come from, you can't actually discriminate based on that either. And ethnic origin, or the color of skin, or the ancestry, or age, or let's say disabilities. We talked about that yesterday as well, because there are so many different kinds of disability. And creed, you can't actually worry about the creed either. In this case, it would be religions. And sex and pregnancy. You can't define sex, and you can't define that a person is pregnant, and therefore you can discriminate against them. You can't do that either. Family status, also marital status. Just because you're married doesn't mean you should be exempted from opportunities. Sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression. Maybe you like to dress up in dresses, Keston, and I'm not going to worry about that.
Sure, only on Tuesdays. You can't blow.
Okay, only on Tuesdays. And record of offenses and receipt of public assistance. So these are some of the things you can't discriminate against. I don't know if you ever saw this, but I just remembered this. There was a TV program on once called Practical Jokes. I don't know if you've ever seen that one. Bloopers and practical jokes. And there was a major star. I can't remember his name, but he decided to play a little trick on his daughter, who was actually in the field as well as an actress, and she was in need of a secretary. And she was looking for somebody specific, and she didn't quite, where she was going to find them. And he arranged for, because he knew the kind of man she likes. So he arranged for a man who was looking for a job in that particular field, who happened to be an actor that she didn't know. And this guy came in for an interview, and her and her girlfriend were in there. And every few seconds, she would go back to her girlfriend saying, this guy is hot. She wants to hire him as her secretary. And she goes back out and she sits down and she says, you seem to fit the bill in a big way. You have all the skills I'm looking for. And he says to her with a straight face, he just looks her in the eye because she's all smiles. And he says, there's only one thing you really have to know. At 5 o'clock each evening, I'm Sally. So her jaw dropped right to the floor. It was really shocking to watch. Anyhow, let's get back to this. So these are the grounds you cannot discriminate. And believe me, there is always the possibility you can run into a situation where you run into this kind of discrimination. And we talked about yesterday, one of the precursors to this, if you wanted to prove that this is taking place, you would have to have proof. And that's going to be a real challenge. And remember, this was based on the Supreme Court of Canada. They had 3 different options for how you could prove this. The problem is you would really have a hard time proving it. Discrimination is not defined in code. No, it's not, because it is flexible in many different ways. The courts look at this in a very different way. They look at it as 2 potentials. Number one, you deliberately did this, or you did it without understanding the implications of it. And this happens sometimes. People do really weird things. Maybe they ask you questions and you don't want to answer them, and this is during an interview, or they're not supposed to ask those questions, and yet they'll ask them because they don't know any better. They really, remember, we've talked about this several times now, they don't know, then you can't really hold them responsible, because it would have to be, you should know this, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's true. Sometimes you just don't know these things. Changes take place all the time, and it's hard for some people, especially those who may be coming from other countries where it's totally dissimilar and the behavior is totally dissimilar and character is somewhat challenged in a different way. So in this case here, they interpret it as either it is deliberate or it is not deliberate, and they have to look at it very carefully. It can be intentional or unintentional. And really, sometimes you can do things and not realize that they're taken in a different light because maybe it's not the same for you. I know that a friend of mine actually used to say that she was always upset by the behavior of one particular gentleman who loved to put his arms around her, give her a big squeeze, a little kiss on the cheek. Now, he's Italian. In Italy, that's something you would expect to see, but not necessarily in North America. So again, does the individual actually know the difference? Well, if they spent a lot of time in a particular area, particular culture, they may not understand a different culture entirely. In fact, it's very difficult to understand sometimes. Just to give you an unusual example, a friend of mine was in Europe and went into a washroom. If I remember correctly, it was Italy as well. It could have been France, but I think it was Italy. And he went into a communal washroom. Now, communal washrooms that are operated by the municipality, they don't have any stalls. So just think of this. There are no, let's say, there's no walls in between. So if somebody sits down to go to the toilet, the person sitting right beside you may be the opposite sex, and they're actually going to the toilet at the same time, but they're right beside you and there's nothing in between you, okay? So you may have 5 or 6 of these toilets side by side. This is a communal. Now, it's not for male or female, it's for both. So this is something that really shocked him, but this is part of the culture. And in many cases, people don't worry so much about their appearance when they're in the toilet. So it could be unintentional. What I'm trying to get across here for unintentional is that you just don't recognize it as being wrong. Adverse impact discrimination, job requirements that exclude certain ethnic groups. This is something that, as I explained yesterday, when I was a kid, if you wanted to be in the fire department or the police department, the minimum requirement was 6 feet tall. You had to be 6 feet. There were no short police officers. And the reason was a simple one. The one that was given to me was that you had to be able to run very quickly, and they didn't consider short people capable of doing that. Again, it's prejudice in its own way, but it's also discrimination and discriminating against individuals who don't measure up to expectations that somebody or some group has. So nowadays, these do not exist, okay? These particular ones, especially in the police and the fire department, they do have requirements, but it's a lot to do with your physical capabilities. So height restrictions is just an example, but it could also be other things as well. Hair color, it could be, let's say, physical conditioning and things of that nature as well. And we also explored the idea of the bona fide occupational qualification, where you couldn't actually do the job simply because there is something missing. It could be you don't have a driver's license, so you can't drive, or you can't actually operate heavy machinery because you don't have the certification or the training for it. So there could actually be a rational reason, and that would be bona fide. Heavy onus on the employers to ensure that the workplace sensitive to the needs of the individual and also the groups. And remember, I stressed this yesterday, it is an absolute requirement for a company to ensure that it is a safe, harassment-free zone. People should expect that when they go to work, they are safe. They're safe from harm, they're safe from harassment, from any other kind of activity whatsoever. This is not always the case, but that's something that your supervisor or manager is responsible for, legally responsible. the Human Rights Code, and also the 17 prohibited grounds. So let's just quickly recap because you are definitely going to have to know them. And they're all here. So the 17 of them, when I share this, I've already shared it, by the way. So you should actually be able to remember all of these. In most cases on the final exam, you're asked for a few of them, but you may be asked for quite a few. So just keep that in mind. This is something, as I mentioned yesterday, you need to memorize. You have to know what they are. So it comes into play in the following in every human resource function. Virtually everything you do in human resources, all of these human rights codes are going to come into vogue in some way or another. You are going to have to measure your behavior based on it. You're going to have to make sure that people within the organization are aware of a harassment-free zone. And anytime it actually comes up, you're going to have a policy and a procedure of how to do an investigation. Remember, we also talked about the need for a very quick investigation. They are extremely important that they're done right, simply because you are held responsible, legally responsible for anything that goes wrong. And if you were to accuse someone, as I also mentioned yesterday, you cannot accuse anyone of anything. You have to make sure that you can prove everything. And that means not just hearsay, but it has to be qualifiable, undefinable, undeniable. All of these elements have to be incorporated. So, and we need to be aware of how it impacts throughout the employment relationship, particularly recruiting and selection. Because remember, human resource people are just human beings and they have their own pet peeves and their own cultural backgrounds. I've known people in the human resource field I would never want to be interviewed by simply because they have issues and unfortunately they gravitate to these jobs. But in most cases, they are the kind of gatekeeper and the protector of the company's interests, legal interests, to make sure that the company remains legally compliant with all the rules and regulations that apply to a company. So it's up to them, and it's also their responsibility to ensure that the business does remain compliant. And that means training, it means policy-driven systems, it means that managers must live up to the expectations of the company's requirements. And it also means that when issues take place, they have to get involved very quickly. You can't just sit back and hope. You've got to correct things. Impacting on recruitment and selection, well, first of all, when it comes to planning, we definitely want to make sure that we have the right people in those positions. And sometimes you don't like the person that you're actually going to hire, but they have the skill set. As long as they can work with everybody and everybody is happy with them, advertising a job, we're going to take a look at each of these. So let me open them up. Job applications, job interviews, and also conditional offers of employment. In other words, those contracts we're dealing with. Pre-employment testing. This is a big issue right now. And also the use of employment agencies. So these are some of the elements that we definitely want to take a close look at for harassment and human rights. The first one is a job description. Remember, we've talked about the paradoxical problem of trying to acquire enough information that is current. We can contact the managers, the supervisors, and they should basically know what's needed. But we should always talk to the people who are doing the function because they're the ones who have the greatest insight into the operational requirements, the step-by-step process, or the skill sets that need to be applied. So our job descriptions need to be direct and to the point, and they can't take into consideration any kind of, let's say, any kind of condition within those 17 codes. So we want to make sure that it's not reflective of one of those forms of harassment against people or discrimination. Carefully considering the job duties and also the requirements that relate to the prohibited grounds of discrimination. I'll give you an example of this one as well. This is in the United States in California, but it's also been seen here as well, but it's been eliminated many times. One of the problems they ran into was a young woman who was working for the fire department, had been hired on a temporary basis, and they were quite happy with her. She did a great job, so they elevated her position to full time. And then, of course, she had a baby and started to bring the baby in. So her husband used to deliver it several times during her shift so that she could breastfeed the baby. And unfortunately, the chief of the fire department didn't like that very much and terminated her employment because he said it was not, it was a bona fide requirement that she be 100% prepared all the time, and having a baby around the fire department was not appropriate. And of course, she would not be able to do her job effectively. That actually went all the way to the Supreme Court in the United States, and she got her job back plus all back pay, and it set a precedent for how people can be distinguished, that irrelevant is your lifestyle or anything that you bring with you as long as you can perform the function. So that was actually a very important case, ensuring that
Sorry.
Yep.
So in that situation, would they just like switch her job role, like they give her a new position?
No, what they did was they allowed her a certain amount of time to take care of the baby. They also provided her with medical assistance, in other words, information. Yesterday, I kind of explained that companies have to, they literally have to accommodate. Once I have an employee, I must accommodate that employee to certain extents. I actually said as well, you can do this up to undue hardship, which means you wouldn't be able to afford it. So she retained her job, but they would have to make conditions where she would have the time to feed the child. And the husband would have to be there so that if there was an alarm, which he had to respond to, then the child would be taken away by the husband and she could then continue doing her function. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Fantastic. There's been a lot of cases like that where you have individuals who, for some reason or another, are not perceived quite at the same level. And it's usually something where somebody is picking on them, like the chief of the fire department was just kind of picky. And he had no right to be because she was doing her job and she was capable of doing it. But there are some situations where an individual might say, well, you know, you've been doing this for maybe all your life, and yet you don't have the certifications for it. Well, it's up to the company to assist you in getting those certifications because it's a bona fide requirement and you've been doing it. It's up to the company to help you with that. But it is an area where if there was a real valid reason where you had to have something specific or a specific individual for a function, that you would have to have some kind of ability to circumvent the process. So unacceptable to discriminate against someone who speaks English with a non-Canadian accent. This is a common area, especially because a lot of companies want you to do a lot of telephone work. Well, if you're doing a lot of telephone work, sometimes if you have a heavy accent, it's hard to understand you. I know that I sometimes have real difficulty understanding French Canadians who are speaking on the phone or like say on a system like this. It's sometimes difficult because some of the words don't quite settle correctly. And people with really, really heavy accents who are just learning the language, it's difficult. But it's not a good enough reason to discriminate. And again, you should be able to assist that individual, help that individual, maybe give them another position where they don't have to be communicating with the client or with people in the office as much. However, that wouldn't be a very smart idea because you want them to become more competent at speaking, so you should have lots of interaction. So it's not a good idea to discriminate, but as I pointed out, it does happen. Must be aware of the duty to accommodate, and this is the biggie. This means that a company must make a direct attempt to accommodate for the inability of an individual to measure up to the requirement. The individual or the group, unless this causes undue hardship. And it is really tough to prove undue hardship. You literally have to prove that you would go out of business if you had to comply. If, for instance, an individual had back issues or they had issues using a computer, it would be up to the company to acquire the equipment that would make it easier for the person. You can't simply just release them. But if the cost would be so prohibitive that you couldn't do it, that would be an excuse to change their job to something else, or you may have to release them. But it would have to be proven that you just can't do it. I'll give you a really perverted example. This happened in Toronto. It happened with the Tea Eaton company, Eaton's in other words. What happened, and this is some 30 years ago, so this is quite a long time ago. The union is very powerful at some of these companies. And the union in this case, one of the employees wanted to be a driver, and he was in dispatch or distribution of packages. At that time, by the way, when I was a kid, when they were delivering stuff, they actually had a catalog service. You could call them up and they'd deliver it to you. You didn't have to go to the store. Nowadays, you have to go to, well, nowadays they're doing just the same thing again. But in this case, he really wanted to be a driver. I guess because he was unionized, he thought, you know, I'm never going to do anything but packaging and stuff like that. So I want to be a driver. So the company said no because he was one of these people with those really thick glasses that look like Coke bottle ends. You know, the really, really thick glasses. And unfortunately, they said, no, his eyesight is really, really bad, and he just cannot drive one of our delivery trucks. And unfortunately for the company, the union decided to push the matter, and they pushed it to court. The courts actually stated that you could not discriminate against him simply because of his eyesight. It was up to the company to accommodate. So this is where the accommodation becomes kind of a gray area, because there's really no latitude, not latitude, there's no actual extreme unless you can't do it, you would go broke. So in this case, what they had to do was change the windshield. It was a special windshield they put in so that his eyesight would be corrected by the windshield, and also the side windows. I remember this story really clearly because of one thing. He quit. As soon as the truck had been delivered to downtown Toronto, he went out to look at the truck, started the truck up, and then quit. He retired. He didn't care. And of course, that truck, I don't think anyone ever drove it after that. They probably had to remove all the windows from it, because he had to be accommodated for. This is not an unusual thing. Sometimes you have an employee who gets into an accident, can't go to work because they can't get up the stairs, so the company has to put a ramp in. You often see this. All of a sudden, there's this wooden ramp that goes up beside the steps, and they have to move the person from maybe the 5th floor down to the 1st floor. because the guy can't get up the stairs or the person can't move around very clearly, so they have to get a brand new computer. I have heard of that happening many times. Or special chairs that are designed specifically for special purposes. I even had a friend of mine once years ago who actually used to sell tables that rise up. They're hydraulic, and when you're actually sitting, if you can't sit too long, you press a button and it lifts up your desk up to a certain height, and you can then stand up and you can sit down or you can do what you want because you can move it. Well, those things were $1,200 each. And I remember thinking that was quite expensive. I was kind of glad I didn't have any employees like that. So the thought here is you cannot discriminate against somebody who has a disparity of some form, whether it happens to be a language issue or it happens to be a physical or mental disability, whatever it happens to be, you must accommodate. You must find a way of accommodating that particular issue. And that includes having somebody assist them if necessary. And again, it's based on undue hardship. Now, I have many stories, but I'm going to leave those out. So the next one is advertising a job. And again, it's one of those things where you have to be very careful what you say. Not illegal to advertise by word of mouth only. Of course not. However, it is prudent to use a variety of medias. Remember, the person using word of mouth may actually be instructing individuals as to what they're looking for. And what they're looking for may not actually be specifically what the company needs. This is something that can actually come up. I actually know a company who really needs to change their policies. It's a giant company. They have a very unfortunate situation where most of the employees, I'd say 99% of the employees, are all from one culture. And that's the way they like it. So it is an unfortunate thing, but it's a word by mouth. They don't hire through the papers. So here we go again. However, it's prudent to have a variety of medias. Once again, it accesses a larger pool of applicants. You're not looking for just who knows who, but you're looking for a larger number. Remember, one of the things that human resource people really should be trying to attempt to achieve is to break it up a little bit, to shake it up a little bit, to bring in new ideas and new methods and new techniques. And the only way you can really do that is to kind of draw from a larger group. A much larger pool of individuals will give you much more, let's say, opportunities. Reducing complaints about discrimination by using a lot of different medias, then you basically say, look, you know, I threw my net out and wherever it lands, anything in it, then I bring it in. And if I am only using one particular media, somebody else could complain, well, you didn't give me an opportunity because I came in, let's say, another way. The content of the advertising, as I said, the wording needs to be very careful. Should not contain qualifications that directly or indirectly discriminate. Sometimes in advertising, it's easy to make a mistake. It's really easy. You're advertising for a job and you're asking for someone who speaks English, who actually has 5 years experience in sales, or they have a specific characteristics. They have a car that happens to be less than 5 years old or something like. You can add things here that are discriminatory, and you don't want to do that. Sometimes people put in that you need a very specific education, but some of the best salespeople I've ever met don't have a good education. They're really good at sales. And some of the people who are really good at other things, they don't always have the best education. They just have played with these things for a long time. So they really know how certain machines and certain vehicles and certain other things actually function. So sometimes you don't want to discriminate. You want to leave it a little bit open so that you get that bigger pool of opportunities of people coming in. Should contain qualifications and skills required for the position. And maybe that's basically all you should be looking for, because sometimes people put in they're looking for a male or they're looking for a female or a specific age group, and you can't do that. That's discriminatory. Remember, that's part of the 17 different codes of discrimination. We can't actually put those in there. And yet there are companies who, again, they may not know. It's really a question of, do they really understand the rules? And some people just don't take the time to do that. You're learning about the rules, but that doesn't mean that somebody who starts up in their garage doing something like a craft and then builds a little business out of it and starts hiring people, they won't know. And we have to understand that a little bit. This is why a human resource department is so important within a company, and somebody who understands the rules. Should contain non-discriminatory language, in other words, gender-neutral words. A sales clerk instead of salesman, or saleswoman, or server, male server, female server, etc. There are many ways of looking at this. When you look at aircraft, you have a stewardess, you also have a steward. So sometimes it's better to just say an individual who works on an airplane doing the following tasks, rather than actually identifying what you're looking for. If you're going to look for one, you must look for the other as well. Request for Canadian experience. This is it can definitely touch on prohibited grounds, as it points out here. Potential place of origin discrimination. Very much so. It used to be, and it still is for certain fields. Remember, there are bona fide requirements. I've met people who are surgeons. One in particular used to actually be a little store down the road here, and it was like a Max Milk. And the two people who bought it long ago, they're not there anymore, but when they bought it, she was a heart surgeon and he was an intentologist, but a trainer. In other words, he was an educator of teaching medical science in a university. And this was in Kuwait. And unfortunately, when they came here, neither one of them were accepted at the same level. So there are bona fide requirements for certain areas, like medical. But when it comes to Canadian experience, you can't really say that somebody who is doing administration within an office needs to only have Canadian. Sometimes it's better to have something else, because once again, you bring in those unique qualities and skills that you probably never saw before. Sometimes some of the people who do jobs are really, really significant. I'll even give you a story here. And this was a woman who I knew years ago. Her and her husband worked for the government, and she worked for no one. She had a couple of kids, and she had originally been a teacher in Japan and used to teach English. And I used to kind of kid her constantly that I couldn't understand a word she was saying. However, one day a mutual friend suggested that there was an import-exporter, a very large one in Canada, who was looking for someone who understood the Japanese culture. And of course, this is something like 25, 30 years ago. And she applied for the job, not thinking she was going to get much of a job, just a simple little job, and she could take care of the kids at the same time. Today, she's a vice president of that company, because what they discovered was she really understood the Japanese culture, and she knew how to fill out the forms and knew how to deal with the legal system there. So sometimes when you hire people, they bring in skill sets that really could make a difference. So this request for Canadian experience, there are companies that do this. A lot of it is based on prejudice, but it is discriminatory. Fluency in a particular language allowed if it is a bona fide occupational qualification. The only time that this really comes into it is with a government office where there is a qualified, bona fide, qualifiable reason why they need to have French and English. You need to have both languages by default. And that has a lot to do with our country and the way it was set up. However, companies sometimes want you to be able to speak one language in particular extremely well. Or it could be that you need to be able to speak Spanish and you need to speak English simply because they have a lot of Spanish customers. So that would be bona fiable because you're dealing with people who can only speak Spanish in the country you're connecting with. But in 99% of the cases, it would not apply. It would just be discrimination. Strenuous physical work. There are situations like this allowed only if it is bona fide. I'm going to give you an example here. Years ago, I used to have a factory in just between Mississauga and Brampton. I had one office there. And the location, the guy next to me in the other building, he actually used to deliver croissants. They imported them from Quebec and they had this gigantic freezer inside of their building. And they used to deliver them to restaurants every morning. So every morning, trucks would come in, the guys would load up the croissants into the trucks and they would deliver them to the restaurants. And then in the restaurants, they'd just warm them up. But the guys who worked for him, they had to be pretty strenuous. They had to be, in his case, they had to have lots of muscle because they were lifting really heavy frozen boxes of croissants. The only thing is he couldn't keep his employees for more than a few months. And in most cases, only for a few weeks. One of the things that I discovered by watching this was that the guys he would hire would go from a heated environment outside into the freezer, and then they'd go back into a heated environment, putting the stuff in the trucks. The problem is they would end up with arthritis from going into a really nasty cold environment and then back into a hot environment, especially in the summer. You would end up with all kinds of joint issues. And some of those guys were in their 20s, 30s. They were really young guys because these were the guys with all the muscle. And unfortunately, they didn't last long. And many of them, when you first saw them go in for a job interview, they were standing up tall. And when they were leaving after a few weeks, they would always be crunched over because of the pain. This is not a really good environment, but it was a bona fide requirement that they be very strong. So in other words, he didn't have any women doing this. And really, I think he was overdoing it because those boxes are about 40 pounds a piece, and they'd have to carry 3 or 4 of them at a time. Job applications. This has changed a lot since I've been a kid. This has really changed. What is permitted and what is not permitted. So prohibited questions on an application form that directly or indirectly classify the candidate by any one of those grounds, those 17 grounds that we've talked about. To give you an example, they used to be the same design of form that you get nowadays, very long, usually about 18 inches long, the old ones. And it used to ask you what sex you are, what religion you are, how old you are. And I do remember one that asked me to send a picture first. So these things are no longer allowed, period. You can't ask the person their marital status. You can't ask them when they got married. You can't ask anything like that. Remember, I've kind of harped on this over and over again. we're not really hiring the individual. We are hiring the individual, but we're hiring the skill sets that they bring and their ability to use it. We're not hiring them based on their social behavior, even though that could actually be an issue, especially when it's a legal situation. But in most cases, we're just looking at the skills and how they apply them. So these 17 prohibited grounds, you can't ask these questions, not even in an interview. Appropriate questions should be limited to the following: your name, your address, your education, skills, and also previous employment. That's all you really need to know. We really wanted to know about those skills. And when it comes to previous employment, a lot of our students don't have a lot. So what we often tell them is whatever projects you worked on, apply that as well, because that is hands-on experience. The job interview itself, again, you have to be so careful. I've mentioned this before, that it isn't just a question of somebody comes into your office, you have them sit down and you start asking them questions. It doesn't work that way. You have to be well prepared. And this is why I said before too, it's an expensive proposition. It's not a cheapie. We're definitely going to spend a little bit of money preparing for that. We're going to sit down, we're going to analyze that resume. Well, that's time in a day, and any time is actually equated by value, a monetary value. And then, of course, we're going to do a little research on the person. We're also going to probably have them do a test nowadays online, and that's going to cost money. That research is going to cost money. We're going to prepare for the interview. We're going to get all the paperwork that we want to bring into the interview, and we'll have questions. So there's another 45-minute shot. And then, of course, that costs money. And then we're going to have the interview, which is going to be about a half an hour to up to an hour, depending on where you go. And in addition to that, we may have a junior actually phone you and make arrangements and talk to you as well. So that's going to cost a little bit. And then, of course, we're going to have to do some documentation at the end of the interview, and we're going to have to make decisions. So when we calculate all the time, excuse me, we're really looking at anywhere from an hour to 2 hours of our time per interview. So this is quite a bit. So you have to make sure that you have the right questions and that you're very careful what questions you ask. Should not cover the prohibited 17 grounds again. So you may notice something, but keep your mouth shut. You can't ask questions about it. If the individual seems to have pictures of their children, don't talk about it. There are reasons why you have to be very careful what you say, because they can turn around and say, well, you discriminated because I had children, or you discriminated because of my jewelry, or you discriminated against something, my hairstyle, or my color of skin, or my facial experience, or whatever. There can be so many reasons why an individual might actually come back at you. So you want to make sure that all of these grounds are kept out of your questions. Can include questions that touch on prohibited grounds as long as they are part of the bona fide. So once again, you may find that it's necessary. I do know that after 9/11, some serious changes took place in Canada in the transportation industry, where you now need to be able to prove virtually everything. If you want to work at the airport, you need to have bona fide requirements in a big way. So you have to literally answer questions like, who have you associated with? What groups do you belong to? These are questions you cannot ask in an interview. But because of national security reasons, there may be rationality for asking those questions. And I do know that the police department, when they're actually doing interviews for potential candidates, they actually will go out and knock on doors as much as a block away from where you live, just to find out, do people know who you are? and have they ever seen you, and what do they think of you? It may seem idiotic, but at the same time, you don't know. You could have a real character on your hands who's done a lot of nasty things in their neighborhood. So you want to get as much as possible. You have to be careful of informal chat. And this is what I just mentioned. If you see something, if you notice something, the person says something, be very careful that you're not being drawn into it. An individual might talk about, the family and how the family has made it necessary for them to take a small sabbatical, and now they're coming back to the workforce. You can't really dig too deep there because now you're into the family issue, which is one of the 17 grounds. So you have to be careful how you respond to things, because once again, the person could be denied the opportunity for many reasons, but turn around and have a very valid argument that it was discrimination because of you were talking about their family. So refraining from any informal chat about their families. Well, there we go, right back to the families again, and where they're from. This is another area. Be very careful, especially from cultural backgrounds, because all of a sudden you have many things that can come up. You may be privy to information that you shouldn't be aware of. Cover family status, marital status, place of origin. There are a lot of different things here. It could actually include religion or special interest groups that they are associated with. So you definitely want to avoid that particular area as well. And avoiding potential human rights problems, which is another area, using standard sets of questions. As I said, you definitely want to have the right questions to ask. Remember, you're trying to query the individual to find out, do they have the skill set? How have they applied it in the past? And how successful are they at using those tools? And therefore try to extrapolate from them what you can expect. Whether or not they understand the responsibilities of that particular position. And these are little things that you need to know, but you don't need to know any of the 17 prohibited codes. You need to know just specifically about their skill set and the application of it. This is another thing, but once again, each member within it needs to be educated. So using interview teams is another way of looking at this, and this can be in both directions. So once again, we want to make sure that if there are subordinates that are assisting in the interview process, that they're very much aware of what the rules are. In other words, what kind of questions can and cannot be asked. There's a movie I watched a little while ago, just seemed to come back to mind. Ghostbusters. This is the 4 women who take up ghost busting. And one of them is so interested in the guy who's going to be their secretary that she asks him, "Are you dating anybody right now?" That's an illegal question. You cannot ask questions like that. But do they happen? Yeah, they do happen. People get a little curious and they ask questions they basically should not be asking. Remember, you're representing the legal interest of your company, and you're making sure that your company is compliant with all the rules. So you also have to spearhead this by making sure that you're taking care of the questions that can be asked. I can give you an example. I won't tell you the name of the company, but I do know that they have had so many lawsuits because of improper training of supervisors and managers, that they have had so many lawsuits that nowadays for them to sit down with an employee, they are required to contact the human resource department in the corporate office and get permission. And not only permission, but the human resource department will send them a script. They just tell the human resource department what the issue is that they want to talk to the employee about. and they are sent a script of all the questions they're allowed to ask, and they cannot ask any question that is not on that list. And the reason, once again, is because they have been sued so many times for improper questioning or improper interviews or things of that nature. And I very much doubt they're the only company like that. So train interviewers to be sure they are aware of the prohibited grounds. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. That's an old adage, and it's a good one, because sometimes managers and supervisors, they just don't pay attention, especially when it's new rules and regulations. They're just like everybody else. They don't like change. And sometimes you tell them that they can't do certain things. Well, they do it anyhow. So you have to train them and make sure they understand the reasons why. Because remember, and I keep saying this, people don't always understand the rules. And if they don't understand the rules, they can't be, they can't be applied properly. And this goes for people who are the employee. They don't always know the rules either. So they oftentimes do things that are in error by not really understanding. Conditional offer. So once the actual process has reached a certain point, it's a defined time when we decide whether or not we are going to hire that individual. We make an offer to the individual, which is now a point of negotiations for some people. Some people just accept whatever they're given, but the conditional offer of employment has a few stipulations. Human Rights Commission suggests the following should only be requested after employment offer is made to avoid potential discrimination. And here we go with number one. Copy of a driver's license and the date of birth. Remember, you don't get this information. That information is restricted. However, you may need it if it's a condition of the actual employment. So again, it's one of those things you only ask for it once you've made that decision, because you're not entitled to that information. Work authorization from immigration authorities. Well, if you've decided this is the right person, now you can find out are they allowed to work in the country or not. And maybe if they aren't, you can help them become certified to do so. Social insurance card, you have no right to this information unless you are ready to hire that individual. And this is, once again, the conditions. You must have that. If you don't have a social insurance card, the company should be able to help you acquire one. But in 99% of the cases, you need it because of Revenue Canada. One of the requirements in the federal government is that when a person is hired in Canada, they need a social security number so that Revenue Canada can track the individual and track all payments and all taxes and all withholdings. A transcript or a copy of professional credentials. Once again, it may be that it's a requirement for that particular job, and they now want a copy of everything so they can keep it on file. Remember, sometimes the decision is based on you have these things, and therefore they want to ensure that they have a copy of them so that they can go back to them and say, yeah, they have this, they have that, whatever it happens to be. And remember, I've mentioned this before, anything that is erroneous, in other words, you provide a transcript that doesn't really exist, but you just made it up yourself on your computer. Nowadays, you can do anything you want. So if you made it up on your own computer, that would be a serious problem because there is no statute of limitations to firing someone. If you find that their original hire, there was any errors within either the resume or there were errors within the transcripts, you can terminate the individual immediately. There is absolutely no way of coming back at that company simply because you lied. Request for medical exam, there are conditions for this and it must be bona fide. The only reason you can ask for a medical exam would be because there's a bona fide requirement within your job to be in healthy condition. For transportation, you would definitely have to have a medical exam, especially if you were driving a transport truck. Forklifts, I'm not sure about forklifts, but I do know that if you're driving a taxi, you may have to have a medical exam as well. And if you're flying an airplane, 100%. Every 100 hours you have, every year for an older person and every 5 years for a younger person, you have to have a very extensive medical. Pre-employment testing. Now, we've kind of mentioned that a lot of companies have switched over to this because it kind of reduces the cost. As I pointed out, sometimes it can cost you, well, as little as $100 to hire somebody. That's the time you take and all the paperwork and everything else you're doing. It actually costs money to do. But if you have maybe 10 or 15 people, that's a lot of money for your department to spend. So sometimes they use pre-employment testing, which may cost maybe $10 or $20 to have somebody go to a website and do maybe 100 questions. Then they evaluate the psychological, physiological characteristics of your nature based on the test. So it can be cheaper. However, one of the nasty parts is most people are not well trained in how to understand it. So pre-employment medicals or fitness exams, once again, this can be prohibited if you don't have a bona fide reason for it. Different types of job, working on high, let's say high scrapers, if you're actually on a building that is quite high up and you're actually working up there, you have to have a medical because you could have a heart attack. You could slip and fall because you lost your balance or what have you. So you do have to have medicals for certain things. I can tell you that quite a few people do die every year who are working in construction, who work on high buildings, simply because they have inner ear problems. They can't actually get their balance. They fall off a building. We had a guy here in Mississauga actually fall off the front of a building because he had a stroke. Once again, you have to have a medical. And that would go for a truck driver. You wouldn't want to have a truck driver drive into you because they had a heart attack. It's not a good thing. You don't want one with eyesight problems either. I got one of those. One day I was opening up one of my factories on Spears Road in Oakville. I don't have it anymore, but I was going down. I always open that one up because I had an office in there as well. I used to leave the Mississauga one. And when I was going down Spears Road. I was getting ready behind another car to turn in so I could go in and unlock the building. And a truck driver was speeding along probably about 80 to 100 kilometers an hour on Spears Road, which is usually what most trucks drive at on that street. And the guy dropped his glasses. And as he leaned down to pick them up, he didn't see the cars in front of him. So he obliterated my car. And I ended up running in front of the cars coming from the other direction and hit quite a few of those as well. So it's nice if they have a bit of a medical, maybe staple the glasses to his head. So medical and also fitness. And again, it depends on what the job is. Pre-employment drug and alcohol testing has to be a reason for this. And as you've noticed, the airports nowadays require this as an absolute. And the reason is because of what's been happening in those places. Other forms of pre-employment testing, there can be a lot of different kinds of testing. The testing can incorporate everything from how do you use a computer, can you use the programs, Can you lift heavy boxes? Are you able to do filing? And these are just some simple things, but it's really obvious that you need to have skills to use some of these things, and you need to know how to do them properly. So maybe there will be pre-testing. For medical, must be directly related to that particular job. So no matter what that job is, if you were operating one of those big cranes that they install, let's say, buildings with, then you definitely have to have a medical, because if you have problems and you're way up there and you're lifting around tons of supplies, you could drop that on somebody. And this has happened in the past. And one of the other things I remember, my cousin, he used to be one of these people who worked on the high rises in California. And he used to tell me that every so often, some of the guys who might be on drugs would drop a rivet. Now, those rivets are red hot when they put them in, so that when they pound them, they soften a little bit. But sometimes they drop them from maybe 10, 20, 30 floors, and somebody might get hit in the head with it. So again, you want to make sure that if a medical is required for that position, that it's undergone. But it has to be a necessity. Ideally should take place after a conditional offer takes place. You don't want to get somebody's hopes up, and keep in mind, they may have to pay for that medical, or they may have to have a fitness test and they may have to pay for that as well, or your company may have to pay for it. And these things can be expensive. Doctors are not cheap when they notice that a company needs to pay. Remember, most of them are kind of depressed over the government's way of paying back. So they love to have that extra cash come in. Alcoholism, well, there's a problem with alcoholism, and drug dependency is considered to be a disability. And we mentioned that before. When it comes to alcoholism, when I was younger, alcoholism was considered to be just a drug, and anyone who was using any kind of drug was immediately terminated, and there was no excuse, and there was no, let's say, coming back again. Once you're fired, you're fired. It's the same thing as sleeping on the job. Once upon a time, sleeping on the job was the same as alcoholism. People can actually get into serious accidents when they're drunk or disorderly, or they can get into fights, or they can create all kinds of issues. But within the last 10 years, it was redefined as being a disability, because of course, once a person becomes an alcoholic, it's really hard to get away from it. So it is actually a disability as far as the government is concerned. And we, of course, have to deal with it as being a disability as well. So finding an individual who is inebriated, who happens to be very, very drunk, you cannot fire them. You can send them home. That is a part of discipline, but you're also required to help that individual. And yet there are conditions. You cannot physically tell that person, or let's say you can't explain to that person that they must have counseling, but you can supply it. You just can't make them take that counseling. So you try everything you possibly can. Of course, like positive discipline, we are giving them a measure of opportunity to correct the situation. If it doesn't, eventually you can remove them from the company. But it is considered a disability nowadays. The human rights actually views drug and alcohol testing as prima facie, which means face of it. If I notice this, let's say somebody comes in and we're going to consider hiring that individual, and I find out that they are an alcoholic, then maybe I can determine it based on how their reactions are. But it's a touchy area. It's a really, really touchy area. Oops, there we go. So testing for drugs and alcohol is important only if, let's say, the safety of your particular workplace or the general community, or let's say people that you are in charge of. So if you're a bus driver, you're in charge of all the passengers on that bus. The same is true for any type of situation where you happen to be a truck driver, you are responsible for the people on the road beside you, because trucks, of course, can get into serious accidents. So safety of the workplace is compromised if you happen to have serious problems with drugs. Well, that would be a difference. And again, this could be like a crane operator, it could be a driver, it could be somebody who's running a train, it could be somebody working on a heavy duty machine, or something inside of a company where they're doing some professional work and it could endanger other people. These are real reasons why this could be acceptable. It used to be that what would normally happen would they would send you to a doctor, or they would send you to a clinic, or they would send you to a hospital, and you could have a blood or urine test. Urine tests are not as useful simply because of the process of breakdown, molecular breakdown. Blood analysis tends to be unacceptable. And once again, there are very unique ways of taking a look at this. So tends to be acceptable, the urine, because it's easy, it's quick. Blood analysis tends to be unacceptable. Again, it depends on the individual and whether or not they're willing to do this. They may decide that they don't want to go through this process at the time that you want them to. So if they can take a few extra days to kind of cleanse their systems a little bit, then maybe they're willing to do the urine test. It used to be just urine tests. And then, of course, the blood tests were introduced, and a lot of people had arguments with that. It's not the greatest way of testing, but it is one way of testing. The blood test is actually the best way, but it's not desirable. So when you're actually ready to hire somebody, and this is just during that initial process, we really need to let you know that we're going to request this. This is going to be a requirement. During that interview, that original interview, you need to make sure that people understand there are requirements within the company. Remember, most interviews, they're going to ask you a lot of questions, but they're also going to try to explain things to you about their organization, the culture of the company, what requirements are necessary as well. So if there's drug testing required, they're going to advise you of that. I can give you a quick example. I'm a member of the Brampton airport, and one of the things up there for the pilots is that they have to be tested frequently. They get drug testing in addition to the regular medical training as well, medical testing, I should say. So there's a lot of things that go on. But once again, you wouldn't want somebody doing something really weird in an airplane where they're deciding they don't like you and they're going to dive bomb you or something. So this is one of the reasons why they test people so frequently in certain areas. The same is true for bus drivers, people who drive trains, different areas where there's a lot of people's safety involved. You're going to find this kind of this kind of testing. Police department, fire department, people like that as well. So are there other forms? Yes, there are other forms of pre-employment testing. Testing that measures job-related skills, such as typing and computer skills. This is something that does happen quite frequently. Remember, they're hiring you to do a particular task, and they recognize what the cost is to do that task. I gave you this example before where people sometimes will measure how long does it take for somebody to type a letter, because they need to know how much is the letter costing them based on how much are they paying you per hour. So they need to know what is the true cost of your work. I gave you an example of an old distributor of mine. She used to time the staff to see how long it take them to uh, take a product, uh, let's say finish off the product, and then package the product, mail the product out. So she needed to know exactly what the cost was so that she could actually determine what's the overhead, how much of that profit is going to disappear. So this is a valid area where they may want to know, yes, you can type, but how fast can you type? One of the reasons we incorporated our keyboarding program was because a lot of employers, we have focus groups every year with employers, potential employers, where they ask them a lot of questions to see what are they looking for in students when they hire them. What are some of the things that they're not happy with? And one of the big ones was their ability to communicate with a computer. So a lot of students had difficulty typing and they weren't very fast at it. And they weren't very accurate, which was another key element. So that's why we introduced the keyboarding, was to kind of help the students prepare, get better at it. Some students take it, some students don't. So in this case here, testing may actually be necessary just simply to prove that you have the skills to begin with. Pre-employment fitness tests have been frequently challenged. Again, do you really need it? Well, if you work in the fire department, yes, you're going to need it because you're going to have to rip cars apart. You're going to have to kick through doors and you're going to have to do all kinds of stuff. So yeah, and you're carrying 50 pounds of material with you, your oxygen tank and your helmet and all the rest of that. It's about 50 to 75 pounds. And also, is it bona fide? Well, maybe it is and maybe it isn't. So is it bona fide that you're able to use a specific kind of telephone? It might be. If they have a PBX system, which is multiple lines, and you have to know how to use a switchboard, then yeah, it might be a bona fide requirement, in which case they might want to test you. It might be that they want to know, can you actually use a forklift? A lot of people say they can, but a lot of people get killed using a forklift because they really didn't know what they were doing. A lot of people get really seriously injured on those machines too. So a bona fide requirement requires that the company definitely test you, but is it really bona fide? So maybe it isn't. Maybe all you're really doing is you're doing picking. You're going from shelf to shelf and picking product off the shelf. If they're very light, well, you don't really need very much. Employment agencies is another area which is actually quite necessary. It's hard to find people. I've done this now most of my life since I've been a teenager. I've had probably, I'm going to guess at it, maybe 30 or 40 businesses in the interim. I tend to start them, sell them off, and go on to something else. So I've met a lot of people, I've hired an awful lot of people, and I've often found it really tough to find the right person. It seems very easy, somebody just shows up with a resume, but it may not be the right fit. You have to have the right circumstances, the right individual that can work with other people, and they want to work with them. So sometimes finding individuals is a challenge. It's difficult, it's expensive to advertise in newspapers because not everybody reads the same newspaper. And what if you're spending your money on one newspaper, but it's another newspaper people who would like to work for you are reading? Again, we have 4 newspapers in Toronto alone. So which one are you going to choose? And then there are many other papers out there as well. So sometimes it's important to have a third party assist. And because they're recognized as the one-stop shop for their particular genre, whatever that happens to be, their particular category, they become the attractors. They attract the people who are looking for specific kinds of work. And therefore, they're much more likely to be able to do the filtering process, the evaluation of the employee to make sure that they have the skill set necessary. So this is something that is really important to us, is to recognize that this may actually be the best approach. But they also have to be guarded against those 17 different codes so that they're not harassing or they're not actually impinging on somebody based on those particular codes. So if you're using a temporary worker, the code defines that the employment agency as your employer. So the employee literally is not working for you per se, they're now working for that third party. Unless, of course, you hire them full time. They must not discriminate. Again, this is the 17 grounds, and you want to make sure they're not discriminating either. Remember, you really don't have much choice as to who they're sending, except you can say you can reject if you want to, but you really don't see the whole pool of people that might be available to be sent to you. This is an unfortunate thing. Some companies, they do have information, but once again, it kind of discriminates if they show you the picture of these people, because now you can actually be prejudiced against them. So you have to make sure that they're not discriminating either. The code prohibits the employment agencies from accepting or acting on requests from the employer. I do know of situations, and this is a long time ago, very, very long ago, where an employer might actually ask an employment agency, only send me people of this particular group, or only send me people who speak this particular way, or this language, or clear spoken, or clear writing. Don't send anybody else. This you cannot do. This is discrimination. And unfortunately, it sometimes leaves out the best people, because the best people are not always perfect in everything. There are individuals who may be struggling with the language, but are extremely brilliant at doing what they have to do. I've met a lot of people like that. I think I gave you the story of one of them, which is Xiaopin. Xiaopin actually is a PhD, but when I first met her, and this was through the Toastmaster organization, her English was so extremely bad, no one understood a word she was saying, absolutely no one. And it took almost a year before she finally asked me to help her a little bit with her language. Now, there's a reason why she came to me. I used to teach people how to do public speaking as well. And I used to teach them some of the techniques of clearly defining a word. And she came to me, and after about 6 months, and she did this on her own, believe it or not, I asked her to watch TV and try to mimic what the people were saying on the TV so that she got the diction and the tonality and the character of how they were speaking. And she did that. Today, you can't tell the difference between if she was born in this country or born in China. You can't tell the difference. And yet when she's speaking Chinese, you can't understand a word she's saying. And when she's speaking English, she's perfect. And she is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So you cannot prohibit, but if that were the case, they would have prohibited her from working at some of the companies she's worked for, simply because her language was very poor. She is literally in charge of projects and multi-billion-dollar projects. She's really an intelligent individual. So I've mentioned this a couple of times now. We've gone through a lot of these different elements where you have to live up to some of the disparities that maybe the person has. Maybe they need extra training. Okay, so we'll help them with the training. Maybe they don't speak the language very clearly. Okay, so we'll help them learn that language. We'll help them to become better at it. They don't know a particular program very well on the computer. Okay, so we'll help them understand it a little bit better. you have a duty, a legal duty, to accommodate your employee. If there are two individuals who are candidates for a job and you decide to hire one simply based on the fact that, well, they can communicate clearly, but the other one can't, and yet the other one's a better candidate, you would have to hire the person who cannot communicate very well. And then it would be up to you to accommodate that individual. If the individual had a physical disparity, maybe they can't walk too long or can't sit too long or can't stand too long. I've had employees like that. You have to find some way of helping that individual. And sometimes those individuals are absolutely brilliant. What they can do and what they can achieve within a short period of time is mind boggling. So you want to accommodate to the best of your ability. But, and there's a big but here, it's a very gray area. And the reason for it being a gray area is because it's to the exclusion of virtually everything else except where you cannot continue. So you would have to make every attempt possible. Unfair to exclude anyone who doesn't fit perfectly. So if they have the skill set, and that's really what we're looking for, can they apply it well? But there's some other little nuance that they just don't fit in very well, then it's up to you to figure out how to make them fit in. Most companies have policies nowadays, especially the larger companies, where there is an inclusion. You do have to include them, and you have to find a reason and a way of helping them. So, because their needs are different from other people within the company, there have been people where an individual cannot sit down, and there may be a good reason why they can't sit down. So, you give them a desk that actually is elevated so that they can stand up all the time. I've seen this in many companies out there. Some of the big companies have whole departments where people stand up. They don't actually sit down. They have very special ergonomic chairs that they can actually almost stand up in. It's really, companies put a lot of effort into it because, once again, they want the best outcome. So they want the best possible return from what they've actually invested in. And of course, they recognize they can amortize it over a long period of time. The employer must accommodate them to the point of undue hardship. And undue hardship is you just cannot go any further financially, or you don't have the space. That could actually be a serious issue too. Let's say that you have a washroom facility. That washroom facility only has a toilet and a sink, and there is no additional space for a wheelchair to go into. And there's no other space in the building that could actually be large enough that you could separate to put such a washroom. That could be undue hardship where you're restricted by maybe municipal rules that you can't just simply put a washroom anywhere you want. It's actually, and I have done this before, I've actually acquired large buildings where they had to put in a washroom because there had been no exception for it. And it's really expensive to dig up those concrete floors and lay all the pipes and put it out to the municipality. And of course, the municipality has to agree. So you may find that there are certain situations that you just cannot get over. That might be undue hardship. Dignity, all matters must be literally kept to yourself. In other words, these cannot be shared with other people. So all matters must be accommodated in a manner that respects the dignity, the privacy, and the comfort of the individual. The individual must ask. This is something that is also part of Ontario's rules, where an individual, you can't walk up to the individual and say, okay, we're going to get you a new ergonomic chair so that you can sit in a particular way. You can't do that. They have to ask you. This is part of the dignity program within Ontario. Individuals who are in need of something must be willing to communicate with the human resource department or their immediate supervisor. And that information cannot be disseminated to anyone else. So you can't share that information, but you must you must respect the dignity of that individual, their rights. This also goes for a lot of different things. Okay, so inclusion as well, designed with everyone in mind, must make exceptions for people or groups if they request it. And this is exactly what we're looking for. Now, in the process of hiring somebody, maybe I recognize I'm going to need special equipment, a special desk because the individual has a wheelchair. I need a desk that they can actually kind of move under a little bit with their wheelchair. So it might be a special desk, or I may have to lift it a little, or maybe their eyesight is extremely bad. I've run into that in the past. So you have to get special screens for them to see, or special programs that allow them to expand the screen a little bit so they can see what's on it a little bit more clearly. And of course, maybe the keyboard and the mouse are unacceptable. If somebody has problems with their wrists or their fingers, maybe we need a special track mouse or a ball mouse, something that's a little different for keying information into a computer. Or maybe we need something else, a scanner or something. Whatever it happens to be, we're trying to accommodate that individual. The human rights and also accommodation is shared obligation between both. Once again, it's the employer and the employee. Employees must be open enough with the employer to tell them what they need, but the employer keeps that secret and also respects the dignity of the individual by not sharing that information with anyone. It's really nobody else's, let's say, nobody else should actually be involved in this process, except maybe the manager of that department who needs to know, but that's about it. Unions as well, because unions are legal representatives of the employee, they may actually be involved in that as well. So let's take a look at the three of them. The obligations that you as an employer have to go through: accept the employee's request. Now, this is kind of an interesting area because the employee presents to you the need that they happen to have. So you accept the request from them. There's no comment as to, oh, we can't afford that or what have you. What you're really doing is you're accepting a recognizable request from an individual within the company for resources that are needed for them to function properly or to complete their tasks. Obtain expert opinion and advice where necessary. If you think that it's a very expensive proposition, maybe this is a special desk, or maybe it's a special chair that runs up the side of stairs, something that may be quite an expensive proposition, or it's modifying or changing some of the, let's say, lavatory facilities like the washrooms, or putting in a ramp or something of that nature. Maybe you need opinions from other people as to the validity of it for that individual. Ensuring that alternative approaches, so maybe there's a better way of doing it. If they need a ramp or they need an elevator or an escalator, what you might do is move them to a lower floor where it doesn't become an issue anymore. Or maybe if they're having difficulty getting into the building, or let's say they're parking, well, maybe move their parking space and reserve one specifically for them right near the entrance. This is another thing that companies will do. Again, there may be many different things that are required. It could be a place to store things. Maybe they have to have an oxygen tank close to the desk, so you design it so that they have a little cupboard that they can put it into when they bring it into work. There's many different things that can take place here. And once again, you're not sharing this information with anyone. This is totally restricted information. What is shared with you from the employee to the employer is guarded. It's not shared with anyone. There may even be situations where the manager of the department is not given the information, and that might be because of some conflicts that take place as well. It's up to the employee to determine who can be aware of this, but human resources definitely should be impartial and also restrict access to any kind of personal information. Once again, we are going to keep records of the entire process. So the process of the original request, any kind of, let's say, research done in this area or anyone communicated with, or any budgetary information, acquisition, if we do buy something or we lease some equipment, something of that nature, we're going to keep records of absolutely everything that takes place. Again, here we come back to that original request, limiting the request for information to those reasonably who need that information. So as I mentioned before, really, there's only one person who may need this information other than human resources, and that's the immediate supervisor. Since that individual may be the one who has to go out and acquire something or may have to make some changes to their department, that person needs to know a little bit about it, but they don't need to know everything. They just need to know there is an issue and these are the things that need to be done for this particular employee. They should be instructed that they are not at liberty to communicate with anyone else about that individual. Cover the cost of acquiring any necessary medical information. If, for instance, you have an individual who had, let's say, a heart attack or has some lung disease or something of that nature, where they have to have oxygen. I do know a lawyer who was like that. He had to have an oxygen tank, and he would take 2 breaths and then talk to you and then take a few more breaths. He had a heart attack, so maybe they have to bring their oxygen in to work with them. And therefore, you don't have to explain to anyone why that person has that right to bring it in, and nor does anyone need to know about it. So you may have to have a doctor certify they need that equipment because you may have to acquire it on their behalf. It may be covered by the company's insurance as well. So this means you'll probably have to contact a doctor, pay the fee, and that fee must be paid by the company, not by the employee. We can't hold off for 50 years. This has to be done relatively quickly. In other words, you're really trying to accommodate the individual within a reasonable time, because let's face it, we want the best possible return from every penny we pay. And if we're paying somebody and they're not able to accomplish, let's say, a really decent return for us, then we have to step it up a little bit. Get the chair, get the desk, or get the equipment, or get the computer, or whatever they need. Get it as quickly as possible and try to resolve that issue. I do know in Trios, one of the ECs in another campus actually found it difficult to use the mouse. With arthritis building up over the years, she found that she couldn't use a mouse very well. So she made a request to the campus director, the IT department, within a day shipped out a brand spanking new ball mouse, where she actually has this big ball on top and she can move that around with her palm. Again, you do it as quickly as possible because you want the individual to continue to remain at the same level of performance. And explain to the employees why the request may cause undue hardship. Maybe you just can't do it. Let's just say that you were in a building that had lots of steps going up to it, and you had an individual who could, because of some accident, can't walk up the stairs, and therefore you need to put in, let's say you need to put in a ramp. You may find that the municipality won't let you do it. You may find that the landlord refuses to allow you to do it. You could run into all kinds of situations. Maybe you need to have a separate entrance for this individual, and you find out that the municipality and the fire department refuse to give you a certificate that would clear it to go ahead and do that. There's a lot of little issues that could come up that might make it impossible for you to live up to that expectation. So undue hardship, it's not just financial, it could be restrictions. There could be reasons why you just can't do it. It's just not possible. The only alternative, of course, would probably be, rent another building. Well, try to get out of a lease agreement. So that would be undue hardship. So again, it can be a lot of different elements that cause this. Usually, however, it's financial in one form or another. The employee also has a requirement. You can't just simply wait for the company to realize that you have a problem. You have to go forward and say, look, I really need something extra here, and therefore I need to have a particular type of chair or a desk or something. We have an instructor who actually has leg issues and needed a special chair. So the company went out and acquired a new chair for her. So that individual has a special chair just for her, and it seems to be good for her. It actually helps her back, it helps her legs. So we get really good performance out of her simply because we've accomplished something by providing something that helps her, let's say, live up to the responsibilities. So you have to make the request yourself. You have to tell the people, human resources per se, or your immediate manager, why it's necessary for you to have that. And maybe you have to provide some medical information as well. That can be done by let's say, a doctor's note or something of that nature. And if they need to check up on the medical condition to see whether or not what you're asking for is going to be appropriate. Sometimes an individual asks for something they need right this minute. However, if they're in a situation where it's worsening, whatever that condition is, they may need something better. And therefore, it's also up to human resources to determine whether or not the requirement is going to be adequate going forward. So we also have to look into the future and determine, could we acquire something better that you could grow with, in a sense. Answer questions and provide information. This again is only to the person that the request is made. Usually it's going to be your immediate supervisor or human resource department. For most people, it's going to be human resource. They're not going to ask their manager. They're just going to go directly to the company's official, which happens to be human resources. Participate in the discussions regarding the solution. Remember, it may not be possible to accommodate exactly the way the employee wants it to be done. So you might have to find a solution. Maybe, I'm just thinking for a moment, maybe the desk that they're using doesn't accommodate their needs and you have to supply more space. Let's say the person has a wheelchair. The wheelchair is a little wider than a chair, and therefore it may make it impossible for them to use an older desk that has already got drawers on both sides. So maybe you have to give them a little bit more space and a different configuration. Again, you would have to discuss this with them and find the best solution for everyone concerned. And also meet and agreed upon performance job standards, because maybe something is going to change here. So you have to agree that certain things must change in one way or another. Maybe the performance is not that great, so you wanted to increase a little bit by providing what the employee wants. Or maybe you're going to have to say, well, because of the accident I had, I can't live up to your expectations anymore. Once again, the company needs to accommodate You can't just terminate somebody because they can't live up to the original expectations. You have to find an alternative. Work with the employer on an ongoing basis. Well, I think that's obvious at this point for the employee. And if they actually request that an expert get involved in this particular field, could even be a medical professional, maybe a nurse or a doctor or a consultant, whatever it happens to be, you need to work with that person. Maybe they cannot accommodate exactly the way you want, but they can offer something else. So you need to work with them to find a solution. That's the responsibility of an employee. The unions, well, we've talked about the collective agreement and the fact that the union represents the employee. They're the legal representative of that employee. And therefore, they're usually the person who makes the request, or the individual makes a request to the union, who then makes a request to the management. Again, it will always be made to human resources in this case. So they oftentimes take a very active role. Remember, there's a collective agreement, which is the initial contract for all the employees who are in the union, especially in that particular union. So they take a very active role, and that's what they're there for. Sharing the responsibility with the employer to facilitate accommodations. Unions have some real clout sometimes when it comes to acquiring things. So they can actually maybe source what the individual needs, and they do have access to an awful lot of resources that are available. They may be able to shift things around a little bit for that employee. And remember, you just don't terminate people because they can't live up to the original contract after they've been hired. You have to accommodate. So you have to find a solution. Respecting the confidentiality, it would be impossible for the union to share that information because of their mandate. Respecting the confidentiality of all parties involved. This information is not shared with anyone. So if we're trying to accommodate what is reasonable, what is rational, and sometimes it's not totally accepted as rational, but we still have to try to accommodate to some extent. And we try to find a solution. It might be just shifting the individual, but there does come a point where it's not possible. It's just impossible to live up to the expectation that maybe an employee wants. So let's take a look at what is constituted as a undue hardship. One employee registers an accommodation request. Once that actually takes place, it's up to the company to do an analysis. Can we or can we not live up to that expectation? So the onus is now on the employer to present evidence showing that the financial costs, the ramifications for it is just not capable of dealing with. Accommodations would create undue hardship. The company would be literally insolvent. You got to keep in mind, a lot of people look at profit and they say, oh man, you guys have made millions of dollars this year. They forget about all the wages that are millions of dollars every year. You got to keep in mind that it is, in fact, your revenues that are paying for this. So that's your profits. And they're paying for all of the wages and all the incidentals that go along with it. So you may actually be in a position where there is no money. You may be in the hole borrowing money and you just can't continue. You can show that as time goes on, you wouldn't be able to ever pay it back again. So undue hardship usually does have financial ramifications. And I gave you a couple of examples. Maybe the building needs to be modified in some way, and you don't have the rights to do that. And you don't own the building, somebody else does and refuses to allow it. Just to give you a quick example, there was a company in Toronto. It was a restaurant. It was a restaurant makeover. They used to have this little program. I used to like watching that. And the team goes in, and in a few days they try to refresh the appearance of the restaurant inside. But the interior decorator decided to do some work outside as well, and he wanted to paint the outside. And of course, the company who owned the building absolutely refused to allow them to do it because it would change the appearance and therefore, uh, let's say, reduce the value of the building. And they also wanted to put in a ramp and also a guardrail. And of course, the owners of the building said, absolutely not. You can't do it. The city won't let you. So they contacted the city and they found out the city wouldn't allow you to do it because there's only so much space in the pavement and they didn't want to restrict that. So you may find undue hardship is out of your control entirely. You may not be able to do what you want to do. And let's put it this way, if you wanted to put in a ramp to your building, you need to get permission from the municipality. You have to pay for that. And they have to send an inspector out. You have to pay for that. They're going to examine your building. They're going to go over the plans with your architect. Yes, you have to have an architect. And then they have to certify your plans, which again, you have to pay for that. And then you get permission to build. Well, that means you now need the permit. And the permit can take a month before they print it up. In other words, somebody has to turn around and push a key on the keyboard and print the thing. They'll send it out to you. And then you have to contract somebody to come and build it. And they have to have time to build it. So months can go by. It may be impossible for you to deal with. So again, it's one of those things, undue hardship could be financial or it could be just simply you don't have the rights. Undue hardship measured by three fundamental factors. The cost of it. Cost needs to be qualifiable, in other words, recoverable. You can guarantee that you are going to be able to pay it. Cost needs to be related to the accommodation. So again, it's something that is directly related to what is needed by the individual. Cost needs to be so substantial that they would alter the essential nature of the enterprise. That enterprise would not be able to continue to operate correctly. So in other words, it would seriously damage the profit, seriously damage its ability to operate. These are the factors that actually have to be taken into consideration. Outside sources of funding are not available. So if you can't get grants, and there are a lot of grants that are available to businesses to make them more friendly for disabled individuals. Subsidies or tax credits are available as well. Maybe they are, maybe they're not for your particular circumstance. They help to reduce the cost and increase the likelihood of accommodation. Well, again, it depends on whether or not that funding is really available and it's available for your particular organization. It may not be. Maybe you need to, let's say, change some of the furniture inside the office for that individual, and you find out that the money is not available for that, but it's available for something else. So again, it's a question of, is it really available? Health and also safety requirements. This is the third one. Employer must explain all the risks. Once again, it's basically to whoever is interested in whether or not the individual can achieve this. To the employee or the union, you may actually show that it's just not possible. It would create serious hazards for other people in the office. And again, it depends on what it is. Even after all accommodation has been done, is there still a risk? Is it a serious risk? Yes, there could be. Maybe there is a direct risk to other people based on what's happening here. It could be that there's an electrical appliance that's necessary for the individual, and other people could, by brushing against it, get a charge or an electrical shock, or maybe there is some other risk of, let's say, vapors or something that are in the office. This is one of the serious elements that can actually exist. So once again, we have to take a close look and see whether or not any one of those three elements are infringed upon. So fulfilling the duty to accommodate, accommodating people with disabilities, we're trying desperately to make sure that those individuals who have some disparity of one form or another, that we're trying to make it more, let's say, a better workplace for them, a place where they can actually explore their creativity and the use of their skills more dynamically, and we can get a better return as a result. Accommodating employees with drug abuse and alcohol, once again, we will provide some kind of counseling, but whether or not they choose to accept it, we don't know. It's up to them entirely. You cannot force anything on somebody. They have to decide, yes, I'll accept it, no, I won't. In that case, we run back to positive disciplinary actions, and also accommodating employees with their religious beliefs and also their practices. I think I gave you an example, a really good example of this. Company that I'm aware of just in Mississauga North. It's a very, very big company. It's a Fortune 500 company or a 100, one of the two. And it's a giant right across North America. They actually ran into an issue with the Muslim faith where individuals needed to pray at certain times during the day. Excuse me. So what they decided to do was, instead of people just leaving their cubicle and putting down their rug and going down and praying in that position, which kind of restricted people from moving through the path, what they decided to do was take an AV room. These rooms, by the way, are bigger than our classrooms. They're gigantic rooms. And they decided to change it into a quiet room. By doing that, excuse me, individuals who needed to pray at different times could actually go down to that room and they could do their prayers and then they could go back again. It became so successful, by the way, other employees started using it as well. And they were using it as a small chapel. They were using it as a reading room because there was one rule for that particular room. Excuse me. And that rule was you can't talk. So it was a very quiet room, and that was the idea behind it. It became really successful. I mean, a lot of people ended up using it. And when you think about it, if you could actually see that building, you'd know what I'm talking about. They had one of the largest, I've seen only one larger than that, their lunch area, beautiful swimming area. They had all kinds of pools and all kinds of fish in it and everything. A really beautiful, beautiful place. But unfortunately, they needed something where people could go aside. And this was the accommodation. They found a way of solving that problem. Accommodating employees' pregnancy and breastfeeding needs. This has become an issue many times, as many prim and proper people want to voice their opinions. They tend to forget that there is human nature, and therefore children do need to be fed. This is broken out many times, as I gave you the example with the fire department in California. Also on transit, Toronto Transit, the subway, somebody was breastfeeding and a lot of people complained about it. Once again, they tend to forget that they also used to breastfeed. So it's just natural, it's normal behavior, and you want to set aside a space for them if that's what they need. A little quiet area where they can actually go and do what they need to do. Accommodating employees' family status. Again, this is another area that you may need to deal with. Again, it's something that human resources will become aware of, and they need to be able to help that individual through these periods. It could be a variety of different situations in this case. And when it's disabilities, you do have to define what that disability is. So the code recognizes individuals with disabilities may not be able to perform every part of the job. So it's up to you to find a way of accommodating. Maybe what you can do is give them what they can do and take that part they can't and give it to somebody else by taking their part and giving it to that individual. Just kind of switch around the job a little bit. May have to change the layout in the workplace. This is true too. This sometimes can be a problem. Making barrier free, so maybe the individual needs to be able to get from point A to point B, and there are impediments in the way. You have to move them. You have to find a way of accommodating that individual. May have to change the way work is done within the department. Maybe, as I just mentioned a moment ago, each person doing the same job will just give one person more of the thing they enjoy doing and take the part that they don't enjoy doing and giving it to the person who does enjoy doing it. So each person is doing something that is unique, and therefore you cannot rearrange the way work is done within the department. It's one way of doing it, but there are many other ways of approaching it too. It's just a creative approach to it. Employers must test the disability or disabled individual to determine whether disability affects their ability to perform their duties. That shouldn't be a difficult thing to do. In most cases, you can determine whether or not there is a problem. Let's say that there are situations where the individual may not be able to turn to the left. I've seen that where an individual freezes up when they try to turn to the left, but they can turn almost totally around to the right side. They just can't turn left. So maybe you have to rearrange things for them in their cubicle so that it's on the opposite side that they can actually reach. Again, there are many different possibilities, so trying to go too deep into it doesn't help. Size of the employer is very important. The bigger they are, the more money available. The smaller employers, they may not just have the money for it. It's just the way life is. There are cycles within every business, and the smaller you are, the more likely you're going to go through very long periods where there is no money coming in. And then, of course, there will be periods when it's just like an avalanche of money coming in. It's just a cycle. And every company, every type of business has a cycle. So you could find that the smaller the company is, they just don't have the ability. Financially, they can't do it. But the bigger companies that have hundreds of employees, they may find that they can take a little bit from each one that they would normally pay out to those people and put it into some kind of accommodation. This would be part of the budget. Sometimes giving people alternatives. Yeah, a person likes to do a particular job and that's what they were hired for, but maybe it's not possible anymore. And maybe giving them something else makes much more sense. So long-term employees are involved. You really do have to make every attempt possible. Remember, they put a lot into that company, and your company would not be where it is today if it wasn't for the actions of that individual through the years. So you definitely have a requirement to live up to helping that particular individual. And maybe what's required is to create a new position entirely. It involves lighter job duties. Definitely this is going to happen. If an individual has been physically or mentally, let's say, compromised in some way, then you definitely have to help that individual. There are both possibilities, and there are many variations of both. So we try to give them something else for the interim, and maybe it's going to be that way forever. But at least you keep that person with you. Remember, you put a lot of money into their training. You put a lot of time into their building skill. You don't want to lose that if you can avoid it. And one of the things that's important here, this is kind of a bit of a challenge sometimes, but it's got to be a productive job. So let's just say you have an individual who has been in a car accident and they're no longer able to walk around the building as easily. And you decide to give them a simpler job where they just simply stay in their cubicle. However, maybe they're not doing as much work as they did before. And of course, employees can become very disgruntled if they can't see how they fit into a company, or the company seems to be putting them down in a sense. So it's got to be a productive job where they're actually challenged a little bit. Every job should have challenges in it, because if it doesn't have a challenge, it's really not worth doing. It's really boring. You want to make sure that there's some kind of a challenge. If the employee placed permanently in a lower paid or lower ranking position and all other alternatives have been exhausted, the employer can pay the employee the same as other employees doing the same work. In other words, you don't pay them less. You may decide to keep paying them a higher rate. It just depends on what can you do. The example I gave you of an individual who cannot turn left, it does happen when a person has a stroke. You can sometimes lose control of an entire side of your body. I know that does happen. Sometimes people are working and then all of a sudden they start to have pains or want to throw up or something. They're having a stroke or a heart attack. Sometimes the whole side can shut down for months, even years. So you may actually have an individual who cannot effectively operate the same level. And therefore, the company is usually, if it's a larger company, they'll keep paying you the same amount. You'll get less to do, but they'll keep it up. Remember, this is not a one-shot deal for a day or a week or a month. This could be indefinitely. You are required to keep that employee as long as possible. So must seek information in an objective manner. You have to know how long is this going to go on, because you may have to decide on something that the individual can do. And it may actually be a short-term solution, but you have to think of the long term as well. Once hired, the employee has an obligation to let the employer know about the need to accommodate. Remember, they don't have to tell you anything. Once you've hired them, then they can turn around and tell you that there's a need for accommodation. Again, it also depends on the fact that they may not know what they're going to be doing precisely. And maybe they didn't get a chance to walk around and meet the other people and see what they were doing. So they don't know that they need a special desk, or they need a special computer, or they need a special chair, or they need something special. Again, accommodation occurs at the point once they've been hired. So we do know that when the employee has an accommodation request, it must be made to the employer. Employer doesn't go searching or questioning people to see what do you need. It's up to the employee to bring that information forward. So we try to gather as much information about the request as possible. You got to keep in mind, you may not really understand the ramifications. As I said before, something that is introduced today could get worse as time goes by. So you may find that the individual needs a cane next. They may need a walker next. They may need to be moved closer to amenities. There's a lot of different elements that are necessary here, and therefore you need to do some research and find out what's going on. So you search for information about that particular characteristic, and also you evaluate the job of the individual as well, determining the physical demands and also whether they can be altered without causing the employee undue hardship. Again, remember, we're trying to create a safe environment, but we don't want to stress the individual out, and we definitely want to help them as much as we can. So this really does require that you think carefully. It's not just a question of I run out and I buy a new chair. It's got to be something that is going to be helpful. What if they don't have a lot of room where their desk is and they can't put that chair in because it's too big? Or it does things that the desk won't allow. So you have to do some research and you have to get some information about it. If the employee cannot be accommodated in his present or pre-disabled disability job, then review other available jobs with that individual. Again, this is a question where it may be impossible for them to continue. I'll give you an example. I had a guy working for me in Mississauga. This is a long time ago. This guy had fallen off a scaffold on his back, and he literally broke every bone in his body. They had more pins in him than you could buy in a crate. He showed me some x-rays once, and it was absolutely mind-boggling that a person could be in that much pain all the time. This guy used to take handfuls of codeine, and I'm not saying just once, but many times. I used to think he was going to die on me. So he couldn't sit down for more than a couple of minutes, and he couldn't stand up for more than a couple of minutes. He couldn't walk for more than a couple of minutes. He was constantly in pain. You could see it in his face. But he's a very happy-go-lucky guy, and he was a very hard and focused worker. But I often found that I had to put him in another position where he didn't have to do physical work. He could do mental work. It actually worked out really well for us. But once again, you may find that the job, you have to reevaluate it to make sure the individual is capable of continuing. If not, you try to find something else. Assessing all the factors to determine if proposed accommodation would cause the employer undue hardship. Again, it depends on what's necessary. And to give you an example, I think you can think of your own examples in many ways. Putting in a special washroom where there's no facility, putting in extra space for an individual, which may be impossible based on the layout of the building. You may not even be able to do that. There may be many different things. More lighting would be possible, but maybe it would disrupt other people. So again, it might be necessary to rearrange the furniture or the location of the person's work. Again, it might be undue hardship. You may not even be allowed to do it. And monitoring what is happening. So monitoring the situation and continue to meet with the employee's needs. As I said earlier, you really do want to extrapolate forward that when you're seeking information, situations can get worse. And you want to be aware of how bad it can be and also evaluate, is what you're thinking of doing for accommodation going to be valid? Is it going to work out for you? Or do you need to go a step further? Do you need to find something better? Is there something else that would help out a little bit better? And of course, as I've mentioned 1,000 times now, always, always, always document everything. So document all facets of the process, document everything you've done, because an individual could turn around later if you say no and say, well, you never even thought about it. Well, you can show them the documentation, the research, the information exchanges, all of that will be documented so you can show this information. Again, there has to be rational reasons. And as I mentioned before, when it comes to accommodation, it's a gray area, because can you really prove that you would waste all of your profit for 1 year putting in a ramp to the building? Could you not therefore make more profit as time goes on because now you have a ramp? Maybe you could, maybe you can't. Maybe you will never recover because it's just too much money outlaid. You need money to make money, believe it or not. So you may find undue hardship is part of that process. Accommodating the employee who abuses drugs and alcohol, this is different. I want you to remember this one. It will come back to haunt you. Drugs and alcohol abuse is a disability. And therefore, if the legal system calls it a disability, an individual who is inflicted with this particular disability is entitled to any kind of reasonable accommodation. But the point here is, and this is something I've heard of, I don't really know much about it, but sometimes when a person is an alcoholic and they need help, they are refusing that help. But it's up to the company to try to get that help for them. But you can't make them take it. So, as it points out, it's reasonable accommodation. You're trying desperately to help that individual. Typically, an employer must use the employment assistance program, but this doesn't mean the employee has to accept it. Okay, so this you must keep in mind. You can lead a horse to water, but it doesn't mean it's going to drink it. So EAP, Employment Assistance Program, yes, you offer it, but they may refuse it. Recreational use of drugs does not qualify as a disability. Once again, you want to shoot up with some speed or use some other hallucinogenic because your boss looks weird and you want them to look weirder that day. This is not a good excuse for accommodation. However, this is going to be quite an area of discovery because, as you know, marijuana or cannabis is now legal, and it creates some serious issues, especially because the number of people currently using this drug has escalated dramatically in Canada and the United States, virtually everywhere in the world. More people are now hooked on drugs. And in this case here, cannabis is a drug that, yes, it does give you a little bit of euphoria. It does kind of remove pain a little bit. But there are natural things that do much better. And unfortunately, people are getting hooked on using very specific things. So how will that impact, let's say, the office environment? Well, that's a tough one. One that I can't really answer for you. I do know that for schools, because I did do a little research on this last year, one of the things about schools is a child cannot carry, nor can anyone smoke or have any kind of drug within 1,000 feet or 1,000 meters. I can't remember which it is. You cannot even be in the area. If you are, it's illegal. So this is a criminal offense. Even with the right to have marijuana nowadays in Canada, it's still illegal on educational grounds. You cannot have drugs on the educational grounds. The reason for this, by the way, the explanation for the federal government was to prevent children from being addicted to drugs. So on school properties, it's illegal to have any kind of drug. Whether you have the right to carry it outside or not, you can't have it on educational grounds. Drugs and alcohol on properties of employer must require discipline, not disability. Okay, very interesting. So once again, you need permission. You need to let your human resource department know that you have a requirement. And this requirement needs some kind of explanation for your human resource department. They don't necessarily need to know much more than a doctor has given you permission to use this particular, let's say, drug, whatever it happens to be. Religious beliefs. So a company needs to accommodate religious doctrine, whatever it happens to be, to a degree. It's an interesting area. I remember talking to a cleric because I had a number of students who used to go and do prayers. And during a class period, they were going 4 times. That's literally once an hour. And I contacted a cleric to find out why it was so frequent. And he told me it's not that frequent. So I got a chance to talk to those students. employers have to do the same thing. They have to know what is acceptable within a particular religious group. So the employer should allow people to deviate from dress codes for religious reasons. There are situations where this is necessary. We've seen this in the police force where turbans are worn. They're a special type. And once again, we've seen this in the military as well, and in many companies. There may be beard guards, especially where cooking is taking place or something of that nature, or spaces for religious activities or special dress codes. Employers should accommodate religious holidays in work schedules. However, I'm going to throw a caveat in here, and that is that you need to know what those holidays are, and more specifically, what branch of their religious group they are. Because an old girlfriend of mine from India, she told me once that there are over 3,000. I can't remember the exact number, but I remember it was greater than 3,000 holidays in India, which is right because there are an awful lot of religious and also different groups. And each group has their own religious beliefs. Every town has its own religious holidays. So you would have to know specifically from that employee, I should say, which holidays are being the most useful for that individual, because you're only entitled to so many. You can't take the whole year off and expect to get paid. However, I've met a couple of people who think you should. Employers should accommodate religious holidays where reasonably possible. Okay, this is actually important. There may be areas where it's not possible. I'll give you an example. Sometimes employers have accommodated the Christmas holiday because it's a particular legally instituted time when individuals do not have to be working. So sometimes other holidays for other people are associated with the same time off. Instead of giving them a specific day, you give them the Christmas holiday, or you give them the Easter holiday, or you give them another holiday so that they can actually enjoy that. Having somebody working, dealing with customers when nobody is allowed to go to your establishment is not effective. So you have to find ways of accommodating. Do they have other employees that could fill the shift? This is something that you definitely have to look into as well. There are quite a few holidays that are synonymous with different religions and different groups. So you do try to accommodate each one of them. Is that particular day's attendance essential to the operation of the business? In some situations, it might be. Let's say a fast food restaurant needs to have people there working, and maybe a newspaper needs to have people printing those papers. So they're operating the heavy machines. If you can't get somebody else to do the job, then they still have to work it because that's part of their contract. And that would go for any religion. Does the employee have holidays to take as well? So this is another way of exploring that possibility. So we also have the accommodation for breastfeeding and pregnancy. You do sometimes have to make space available for them. It might be that they can do this in their cubicle if they are so inclined, or they may ask to have a special area that they can go to. Maybe a lounge time where they can take the child in and breastfeed that child. Maybe somebody else brings the child to the workplace, especially in younger years. They may need to have their parent right available to them. Some people actually, well, there's different ways of dealing with it. Temporary relocation is a possibility. This is something that a lot of companies try desperately to do. There's always a little bit of space somewhere. Modification of the work duties may be necessary because breastfeeding, it doesn't happen once every 8 hours. It happens very frequently. And also a flexible work schedule with increased break times because you are going to need a little bit more time. And allowing the caregivers to bring the baby to be fed. We try to accommodate because remember, you hired the person because they would be able to accommodate you. They'd be able to live up to the goals of the company. They would be able to provide some kind of a return for what you're paying them. And it was something you really needed to have. So we try to accommodate them because without them, you wouldn't have a very strong company. So we try everything we possibly can to keep that person relatively happy. Do all companies do this? Not necessarily, but they should because it is legally required. Allowing for time for express milk, well, this is another area. And also comfortable and private area to maintain the dignity of that individual. For some individuals, it doesn't make any difference. For other individuals, it does make a difference. And I'm not sure how it works sometimes. I'm not going to say that. I think you're kind. Okay. Employees' family status. Now, this is the last area, and it's an important area. The employers have some obligation to assist the employees who are balancing work and family responsibilities. Well, you know, and I know that family can actually cause a lot of hardship within a work environment. You may have very young children. You want to make sure that they're safe and that they're okay and that you're there for them. Family as well, older parents or your husband or your wife, whatever it happens to be. You want to be there for them. And of course, you can get into arguments. There can be all kinds of situations. So the company tries to help you a little bit. Now, sometimes it's changing your schedule a little bit. It depends on whether or not the company can afford to do that. Some companies can. I do know that one company I've dealt with in the past, what's it called again? It's right on the tip of my tongue and I can't remember the name of it. But they actually have over 1,000 employees. And their employees literally are given the opportunity to create their own shift. So they can come in and once the kids go to school, they can come into work. They do a lot of telephone work. And then just before lunchtime, they head home, take care of the kids when they come home for lunch. As soon as the kids go back to school, they come back to work. And as soon as the kids are leaving school, they go home. They take care of the kids for a few minutes, and then they come back to work for a couple of hours. So they create their own schedule. And sometimes that's possible. But remember, sometimes you're dealing with customers and it may not be possible. So you have to avoid policies that adversely impact those particular employees, whereas you're demanding that they must be at work during certain hours and no personal telephone calls, no personal emails or things of that nature. So holding business meetings after hours is another one. It definitely impacts the family and impacts the children. And this is one of the big areas that they're trying to avoid. And once again, it's prima facie, it's to the face of the issue, discrimination. Each case will be considered on its own merits. And once again, we look at every employee within the company as an individual. We're not looking at them as a group of people, unless, of course, excuse me, you're dealing with a union, in which case it may be definitive based on a collective agreement. And of course, we also wanted to wrap up using alcohol and drugs. So unjustified, except in limited circumstances, safety sensitive positions. Really what they're talking about here is there is no valid reason to use drugs or alcohol unless it's a necessity, and only if it does not bring health or safety issues to those individuals who you are either serving, working around, or something of that nature where there is a let's say, danger involved. If that's the case, then there is no exception. You cannot use drugs or alcohol in that situation. Breathalyzers are seen as unintrusive, and results are instantaneous, more likely to be accepted in safety sensitive positions. I don't know of any company that actually uses a breathalyzer, but I could be a little bit behind the times. The only time I can see a breathalyzer being used is when safety or danger to the general public is involved. Where, let's say, an individual has responsibility for some kind of operation where people could be hurt. In that case, I can see where a breathalyzer would be used if there was the uh, personal observation that maybe there was a reason to use it. Otherwise, I can't see it being used. But again, I don't know every situation, and there's very possibly a reason for it within some companies. Blood drug tests, not instantaneous, more intrusive, less likely to be acceptable. It's probably the fastest way of actually determining if there are drugs and how long ago those drugs were actually introduced to the individual's body. But as it points out here, you are actually impinging on the safety of that individual. By taking blood, you are attacking that individual and causing harm, and you don't have that right. You can't even demand it. Even police were instructed on this many times when they take somebody in for a hospital to have a test. There are situations where a blood test is possible, but it can also be contested as well. There is no reason that you have to go through that process. When drugs tests are likely to be accepted or acceptable, when reasonable suspicion, and again, it's not hearsay. You cannot use hearsay. It's something you have to see for yourself that, yes, there is some kind of impairment, and I need to find out what the problem is before somebody gets hurt. So when an employee has been involved in a workplace accident, it may be necessary, based on what is happening, that the individual needs to be tested for drugs. This could be that they're impaired after the accident, and it is not indicative of the accident. It's not really, let's say, shock, it's something else. So as a result, it might be a reasonable expectation. Alcohol testing for safety sensitive positions, absolutely. You cannot drive a bus, streetcar, train, airplane, boat, ship, if you have had alcohol. And the reason is you're impaired, and you really are. If any of you have ever been drunk, which I'm not going to say you have or haven't, but if you have, you basically know what I'm talking about. You do become a little sensitive to making irrational decisions and choices. It's part of a rehabilitation program, but once again, you cannot force people to participate. Test results are kept confidential. No one, period, not even human resources, needs to know the end result. It will simply be a police officer, a doctor or a medical professional who will pass on the information, and it will be usable only for the company's human resource department. But they don't need to know the full scale of the test or what the results were. They just need to know, yes, there's impairment, no, there isn't. Carried out by a qualified professional. In other words, your human resource department should not be picking you with a needle. I'll tell you a little story. I'm getting bored. I'll tell you a story. When I was a kid, and your children, and probably yourselves as well, every so often the school boards decide to inoculate you for something. Usually because you don't like the teacher, so they're giving you a needle for your teacher. But they were giving one for, if I remember correctly, it was polio. And I was just a little kid, really little kid, probably in third grade or second grade. And the kid in front of me, we all lined up. There's got to be 100 students in 4 or 5 lines. And they had 4 or 5 nurses giving needles to every kid. And I remember the kid in front of me, he was so, let's say, cowardly. He was almost on his knees. And he had a right to be. When he actually went up in front of me, they put the needle in and the needle broke. So the needle stuck in his arm. And I have news for you. I never moved so fast to the end of the line as I did that day. I basically crawled to the back of the line. I scared the hell out of every kid in the room. Fantastic. I just needed a laugh. Okay. So tailored to individual circumstances again. Once again, we're trying to accommodate the needs of those particular individuals and the organizational requirements. But you cannot simply administrate this without permission. The individual must give their consent to it, and they can easily turn it down. Now, there may be consequences based on a bona fide rationality, but otherwise, the individual is expected to accommodate somehow. And again, some kind of accommodation or rational meeting place will be decided upon between the two of you. So the human rights system, there are 3 pillars to the human rights system in Ontario. The Ontario Human Rights Commission, the Human Rights Legal Support Center, and also the Human Rights, let me just check something here. Okay, and the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. So I've been talking for a long time. Let's take a 10-minute break. We'll come back. There's only a few slides to finish. So we'll take let's take a 15-minute break. Let's be generous.
Okay, sounds good.
Yep. Okay, are we back?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Fantastic. We're almost finished at this point. So let's take a look at all three of these. And once again, because we're drawing attention to it, it's probably going to come up in a test. So just be aware of the acronyms: OHRC, Ontario Human Rights Commission, the HRLSC, the Human Rights Legal Support Center, and also the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, HRTO. Just be aware of these three. So the first part of this is the Ontario Human Rights Commission. It really is a question of, it requires that you put in a complaint, and then they'll act upon it. They'll actually make a determination as to whether or not it's a valid complaint. So develops the public policy. This is basically what they do. And at the same time engages in proactive measures to prevent discrimination using public education. They actually produce a lot of educational material available to the business community. So if a company needs help or needs information or needs a policy correction, then they will assist in that particular area as well. Brings people and communities together, and also resolves the issues of tension and conflict. Fundamentally, businesses do need to have assistance in these programs, and they do have a lot of materials available, and it is a complaints-driven system. The Human Rights Legal Support offers human rights legal services. If you need any kind of lawyer or any kind of court action, this is the department that will assist you throughout Ontario and who have experienced discrimination. So if you have had an issue and you cannot resolve it, you need legal help, they will provide that for you. Centers range from legal assistance in filing an application, the Tribunal of Legal Representatives on the human rights applications. They actually will help you fill out all the forms and do anything that is necessary to take action against the business that is infringing on your particular rights. The Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, again here, once again, you must submit your complaint. They don't go looking for you, but they have incredible capability and power. Here's all the complaints that are made, and that determines whether or not those complaints require any further action whatsoever. Sometimes they really do, and they do have some amazing power. They will investigate. They also have the ability to apply fines if necessary as well. And prior to 2008, complaints went to the Human Rights Commission, first to be assessed before being heard by the tribunal. But now they have the ability, they'll send out commissionaires, and these individuals do have the ability to require that the company provide information, policies, procedures, and any documentation. They really do have a lot of power. I can give you examples, but I think I've given you those examples in the past where people have run into issues with human resources or with a company's policy and had to seek help from the government. So in this case here, the Human Rights Tribunal will actually look into that complaint. After 2008, all complaints made go straight to the tribunal at this point, but prior to that, they used to go to the Human Rights Commission. So how do I go about making a complaint if I have one? The form is available on the websites. And in addition, applications should be filled within 1 year. There is a statute of limitations, so you definitely want to fill that out. And also sent to the tribunal. They review the applications. Checks are then grounds. What was the, was it in Ontario or Are there actual grounds for the application? The process takes a long time. I've known people who have had to send these in, and they do take a very long time to be processed. So don't expect something overnight. Send a copy of the application to all parties. This is what the government will do. And respondent files the response. Tribunal offers voluntary mediation. Again, remember, in some cases, the individual may not believe that they would be able to speak up or that they would be taken advantage of. So sometimes mediation is the best approach, where both parties are brought together so that they can communicate with one another. Again, if there is an issue, a tribunal can be set up. So if the mediation is going to be refused by either party, and sometimes it's the business who will refuse it, and sometimes it's the employee, simply because they don't think that they have a strong enough position. So then it goes to a hearing before the board, and it will go before a tribunal. Some of the remedies when there is a discovery here, the financial awards can be provided, specific damages, loss of earnings. Let's say you've lost your job, or you believe that you've lost income. If you can prove that, then you may get damages for the lost income as well. General damages, loss of dignity and self-respect. There is kind of a punitive type of damage. And also damages for mental anguish, limited to $10,000. Again, these things change as time changes. So you can see these changing depending on the province as well. Non-monetary awards that are provided, reinstitution order. In other words, you get your job back. So tribunal orders one party to fix the problem, changing policies, doing training. It may even actually, as I said, get your job back or receive your pay back. I've seen situations in other companies where an individual is accused of damaging or destroying property, which may or may not have happened. I have no idea if it did or not. But sometimes the company will seize your paycheck. Unions also do this, excuse me. If you don't live up to the expectations within the contract, they sometimes will fine you and take money away from you. You can go to the board and you can levy a complaint, and they will reinstitute your particular pay that you've missed or lost. This could actually include more. It could include interest as well. And of course, there could be other damages provided. But policies and training will have to be incorporated within this as well. So if the individual needed to have special training, then training will have to be provided for the individual. If the policies are restrictive in the individual, let's just go back to our breastfeeding situation. There is no such thing as a privacy or dignity area for the individual, then the company will be required to create one. Excuse me. So that basically wraps up this. Oh, there's another one, sorry. Reinstatement now available under the code. Well, that's the one I just talked about. So that basically covers this particular area of human rights and also the code of harassment of 17 different codes that are available. Are there any questions up to this point?
No, sir. No questions.
No questions?
Yep.
So my question is, what did we just talk about? Can you remember?
Honestly, I'm gonna have to do a lot of review. There's a lot, man. There's a lot.
Yeah. Chapter 10 is a very big chapter. So I'm sharing some files in the chat here. You have the second PowerPoint. The first PowerPoint is above that. And of course, those 3 files that I gave you yesterday, I'm giving them to you again for Keston. here you have one for the right kind of questions that you should be asking when you're doing an interview. So that is the questions not to ask during an interview. And also there are two case studies, one here for undue hardship and the other case study here for discrimination. Read through these because they will give you a better insight, a much better insight into what is expected, what has happened before, and it'll also give you a better sense of some of those 17 and how they actually apply in different situations. So,
Okay.
yep. Having said that, I'm going to let you guys go. If you have any questions, just jump back in. I'm still here until 5 o'clock.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Here.
Have a good afternoon, guys.
You too. Ciao.
Have a good afternoon reading.
Oh, thank you, sir.
All right, ciao, guys.
It's my gift to you.